I think I hold the record. Oh, he's
Jeff's
coming.
not here.
Oh, that's why I know what he knew what I was doing.
Okay. There we go.
Sorry, everyone.
No problem.
Andy still holds the record for later.
I do. Believe that.
10 minutes.
You're never gonna live it down.
Let's start without you.
Okay, everybody, let's get started with the Nantucket Conservation Commission meeting for Monday, March 11th. If you are recording, please let us know. Are we recording? Okay, and we are recording, so yeah. And if you could silence your cell phones, that'd be appreciated. And if you can't hear me, just let me know. We'll do our best here. Okay, there we go. Okay, we're going to start with the public meeting for public comments for items not being heard tonight. Okay, seeing not, we're going to go to the public hearing. Notice of intent, Sconset Beach Preservation Fund, 59119 Baxter Road.
Can we set up in front of the microphone or?
Yeah, I mean, this one? We got a bunch.
Good afternoon. My name is Dwight Dunk with Epsilon Associates, representing SBPF. We also have in attendance Stephen Cohen and Mr. Joshua Cohen. Mr. Joshua.
Louder.
We're totally interchanged.
Sorry, it's been a long day, long couple.
Is that better?
Of weeks. Yes. And
Can you guys hear it? Not yet? There's a dead zone over here. Yeah.
Mr. Joshua.
Okay.
Microphone closer to you.
Okay, how's that? Well, this is mainly for the recording, so I'll.
Okay.
And Mr. Josh Posner.
Okay.
Okay. And what we wanted to do was run through the major topics that have been the topic of discussion for the last several hearings, represented in the most recent letters. One of the things we just want to point out for the record is the receipt of some of the late comments. We, at the hearing on February, Jeff laid out a schedule for response to comments on the February 11 hearing to be received by the commission by March 1, and then follow up by March 8. So there were some comments that were received after the March 1 deadline. We have responded to them in writing and submitted those to the commission on March 8, but we just wanted to note that for the record, that we think some of these late comments works to delay the process, and we're trying to keep the process moving along. With that, I'd like to just go through the PowerPoint. Hopefully everybody in the audience can see it. And I did email it to Jeff, so hopefully he can, or Joanne, hopefully they can forward it to you guys, and you can see it on your tablets. Just as by way of reference, keep as if we need remembering, this is an extension of the existing project. It's an extension of nearly 900 feet to the north and nearly 2,000 feet to the south. The existing project was previously approved through both a superseding order of conditions and then a subsequent notice of intent with order of conditions for the fourth tier. Just stepping back a little bit, the basic project purpose and need for the proposed bank stabilization. This is from Mr. Berman's report to the commission back on February 1st. And the left side shows what happens with an unprotected coastal bank. You see T1, time 1, time 2, time 3, storm, it washes away material, causes an oversteepening, and then the bank sloughs. That's T3. And the whole bank moves landward. The proposed project is the extension of the existing project. The purpose is to stabilize the coastal bank along the Sconset Bluff. The functions of this bank or the that identified in the regulations are twofold, and those are to protect the stability of the bank. That's a function of a coastal bank, and coastal banks can also be sources of sediment to the littoral system. And this coastal bank provides both of those functions. So the proposed project, let me get a pointer just to make it easier. And therefore, the existing project and the extension project are designed to meet those two functions of this coastal bank, such that when there is a storm, you have the geotubes in place, there's a storm, it washes the sand off the face of the geotubes so that the sand goes into the littoral system as a sediment source. But it also is providing the stability to the coastal bank, which this bank does both of those. So therefore, the project needs to be designed to meet both of those functions. And it was designed to do that, to provide the stability and the sediment source. And we did provide 2 additional cross sections. The design docs, or the design plans did show one cross section. We added the additional 2 up at the northern end where the bank is the highest. But the reason that I'm including this in this presentation is primarily because the schematic that was shown by Mr. Berman, what happens with a bank that's a sediment source, is that the red line here is the 2017 bank cross section. The blue line is the 2018 bank cross section, which shows that the storms from last year up at this northern unprotected limit of the project have that toe scour. So therefore there could be, eventually oversteepening and erosion. Therefore, the need for the project to anchor that toe and rebuild the template, and then that will serve to stabilize the bank as shown in the schematic. So that's the basic project purpose and need, and the design that's designed to meet the performance standards and the requirements of the regulations. So in this hearing, we'd like to address the topics that we've talked about many times over the last several hearings. And these are the topics that we'll run through tonight. Commissioner Golding had identified homes that he felt were in question that were not eligible as pre-1978 homes. We had likewise provided a evaluation of all the homes on the east side of Baxter Road in the November 16 letter. I believe it was November 16 letter, where we evaluated all the homes. Comparing our assessment of the homes that were eligible and not eligible to the homes that the commissioner identified as not being eligible, we found 4 that we disagreed with that we believed were eligible. And those are 83, 79, 77, and 73 Baxter Road. In our March 1 correspondence, we provided our rationale for our decision. Just going to run through that tonight. 83, the most northerly structure of those 4 homes, we've found that we think it's a 14% increase in floor area. We've assumed it to be habitable space. In terms of trying to parse out what is habitable versus what is floor space is a challenge from the building department records. But working back in time, 2001, there's a permit issued to relocate a 1-story, 2330 square foot dwelling. 1991, there was a building permit issued for a 200 square foot sunroom addition and then a roof. In 82, there was a building permit issued for a 99 square foot kitchen addition. Now, when we look at the building record, there's some challenge in trying to figure out what is the baseline square footage. From the building records, all we found were these permits. So with this 2330, subtracting out these two additions, we get a baseline of 2041 square feet, and when we do that, we get less than a 20% increase. Now, these were the plot plans included with those with those building permits. We see this is the house in 1981 for that first building permit. This was the 99 square foot addition. This was the sunroom addition. And this is the house move with the outline of the house. So with that, we had that addition in that corner, that there. So the base line house back in 81 seems to, based on the math, be 20,040 square feet. 79 Baxter Road, the next one heading south. Again, trying to establish the baseline becomes a challenge. However, looking at the record, 2013 was to relocate the single-family house identified as 3738 square feet. No change in habitable area was noted. 99, windows, roof walk, no dimensional changes in habitable area. 97, 287 square foot deck, not habitable area. 89, in addition, again, it was unable to determine the square footage of the baseline square of house. So again, using the newest data, subtracting out the new living space with the addition of 466 square feet, we get, again, less than 20%. We get 77 Baxter Road. Again, the records are tough to identify baselines and changes in additions, but we have the two building permits in 06 to demolish, remove habitable space, in 05 to move the house and add 555 square feet, so we get a 3 square foot reduction in floor area. And the same type of, for 73 Baxter Road as the others, we get most recently to relocate and demolish 350 square feet, add 150 square feet. So we get a 200 square foot reduction in 2012. We get a garage with storage that's not habitable. 89, we get an addition. So we have a net of 53 additional square feet. And in 86, we get the addition of a second story bathroom. Bathrooms aren't included as habitable space. So again, it looked as though from the 86 that we had, that there was 50 and 34 square feet floor area. When we look at the 53 square feet, we get much less than a 20% increase. So in terms of the four houses that we had a disagreement on, that's our rationale for saying that those ones are eligible. Another topic that has been discussed several times is maintaining a walkable beach in front of the existing Geo Tube system. And this is from the 77th survey that was performed last fall by Woods Hole Group. It's part of the surveying that they've been doing and monitoring that they've been doing for over 20 years. Just want to step back quickly. They have two profiles that are in front of the existing array. So 91, 91.5. So 91, what we see is what the blue dots are the changes of the mean low water contour over time. Blue is before the Geo Tube system was installed. Red was after the Geo Tube system was installed. So what we're seeing is the mean low water was staying around the same, bouncing around minus 130 and minus 90 from the baseline. It eroded out a little bit. This was the large erosion event in 2012, 2013, which meant the sediment from the coastal bank went out onto the beach. It built out onto the beach. The Geo Tube system was installed. There's been a slight erosion of that material into the littoral system. Then we had the last March's event, so we get some buildup onto the beach, and then slowly that material goes into the littoral system. So what we're finding is that from about February of 2005, which is well before the existing system was installed, we see the shoreline eroding and accreting, moving back and forth, landward and seaward, within this range of about 40 feet. And actually, since then, it's a slightly lower, smaller band. 91, which is in front of the Geo Tube array, we see the same thing. Since 2005, the material, the mean low water, again, moving landward and seaward over time as material from the littoral system builds up, washes in, builds up, washes in, material from the coastal bank, going into the beach system, going into the littoral system over time, then washing into the off the template, onto the beach. So what we're seeing here is over time, the shoreline, the mean low water contour, is moving landward and seaward within about the same 40-foot band for the past 14 years.
Question about the scale on the x-axis. You're not on exact 3-year increments. So are our dots like random summer, winter data?
No, those are the quarterly data points that Woods Hole Group plots.
Okay.
So those are the quarterly data points that these are the data from before the Geo Tube system was installed. These are the points after the Geo Tube system was installed. And these are the two profiles in front of the existing Geo Tube array. So we're not seeing an accelerated loss of beach in front of the Geo Tube. We're seeing that the mean low water is moving landward and seaward as materials washing off the template onto the beach as it's being washed off the beach over time into the littoral system, what material from the littoral system being deposited onto the beach, etc. So it's showing that dynamic shoreline, but we're seeing a fairly consistent movement of that mean low water contour for the past 13 years.
So, please, could you explain, so that's an actual 100-foot variation between
From
96 to...
from the baseline point, correct. And frankly, yes, we are seeing that the shoreline has been eroding, and that's the purpose of the project, as we started out with, that we see that the shoreline, the bluff, is eroding, and the purpose is to, in terms of the interests of the act, the interests of the bylaw, to improve the interest of the bank to perform the function, the interest of coastal bank being stabilized in the coastal bank, and then the sand is to provide the sediment source. Now, we also have been told that the Geo Tube system is causing increased erosion at the ends. These are the two profiles to the north and the two profiles to the south. I'm just going to scoot back quickly to that so you can see it's 92.1, 92, 90.85, and 90.8. So we're looking at the profiles that are closest what's called the new lines. So it's the ones that are closest to the existing geotube ends. And since the geotube was installed, the 3-tier system, in the 4 years from October 14 to October 18, again, this is from the 77th survey, we see at 92.1 and 92, we see accretion. We see some retreat. This was in about the location of the clay head. When we look at the raw data, we see that at 92, from October 14 to October 15, there was about a 10-foot retreat in that 1 year period. And then from 15 to 18, there's been about 4.4 feet of accretion. So when we see this retreat, there's a large retreat, and then there's been accretion. And then at 98.5 and 98.5 and 90.85, we see accretion. So the likely source of that sand off the template is from, remember the discussion with Gordon Thompson, with the different types of sand movements of, and one of them was diffusion, also cross shore, and then the long shore. Likely this is diffusion off the template with the sand going seaward, going to the north, going to the south. So that we don't see the template damaging the immediate beaches on either end of the array. And lastly, looking at some of the nearby beaches, we looked in front of the geotube, we've looked immediately adjacent to the geotube. Now we go profile 90, which is about 1,000 or 1,500 feet down south of the existing geotube system. Again, we're seeing this, the reason for the project. There has been erosion over time. From November 07, or from 2007, 2008, we're seeing that actually earlier than that, we're seeing that the beach has had periods of accretion, periods of erosion, periods of accretion. Again, this is the large erosion event in 2012, 2013, where the sediment off the eroded bluff went onto the beach, and that has slowly been working its way into the littoral system. There's a little buildup again. So again, we're seeing we're seeing the sand, the mean low water contour moving about in about a 40-foot band from -50 to -10 from the baseline. After that first year, right after that large storm event, it actually built out quite a bit, and it's been contributing to the littoral system over time. Again, to the north, this is more in the northerly section. We see the same trend. We're not seeing an accelerated erosion of the beach far afield from the system. Again, we see what we've just saw. We see in here, it's actually, that's minus 30. So again, about a 40-foot band from 05, 06, where the mean low water is accreting, eroding, accreting, and moving about that -50. So the data from Woods Hole Group that they've been tracking for decades is not showing any accelerated erosion in front of the system, immediately adjacent to the system, or to the nearby beaches. And we credit a lot of that to, as Mr. Berman had talked about, with this system, the existing geotube system is probably about 3% the length of the shoreline on eastern Nantucket. Much of the sand that's in the littoral system is coming from the littoral system to the north-south of the project area. However, as we've stated many times, to mitigate and to provide that function of sediment source, the project includes sand mitigation protocol. It involves placing sand on the tubes. When the tubes are exposed after erosion events, they're recovered from the top of the template to recover that and make sure that their sand will be available into the littoral system for the next storm. So we credit, what we're seeing in the data is showing that it is a dynamic system. There is a lot of sand moving around, and as part of the as part of the orders of conditions, part of the project, sand is provided to the littoral system to mitigate for the placement of the geotubes at the base of the bluff. What we've proposed for the extension of the existing system, and we've talked about this before, but just when it's completed, to make sure that it's covered with 22 cubic yards per linear feet along the entire extended project. Then during the year, when there are storm events that cause erosion, that those get recovered by pushing sand off the top of the template, off the side to recover those exposed tubes. Every year, there is a requirement for a topographic survey. We'll use that to determine the volume of sand that was deposited off the template in front of the system and then washed off and contributed into the littoral system. And with that, we'll replace that volume of sand to refill the template to 22 cubic yards per linear foot. Now, one of the things that, through the discussions that we've had, the comments from Mr. Berman, who identified that the sand mitigation is a good part of the project design, and it's also in compliance with the regulations and CZM and DEP policies. What we've identified in our most recent letter is to modify the protocol a little bit by proposing to replace a minimum of 8.8 cubic yards per linear foot of sand, which recall from the September 17 hearing and other submissions that's the length-weighted average annual contribution of sand off the coastal bank for the extended project. That's the 12 cubic yards per linear foot for the existing 950, plus the 7.7 cubic yards per linear foot for the additional nearly 3,000, and that gives a length-weighted average of 8.8 cubic yards, or the volume of sand contributed off the template that year, whichever is greater. Okay, so what we want is showing that there's a commitment to meet what is the current average contribution, or whichever is greater. And just one other point, as shown in the November 16 letter, in front of the Geo Tube for the proposed project, in front of the top two tubes, because the lower tubes are buried below the beach, that volume of sand is about 6.2 cubic yards per linear foot. So in one erosion event where the top two tubes are exposed, that's 70% of the annual average. We've also compared the existing project to the extension project. And remember, the existing project has been approved by the DEP for the original 3 tiers. Again, that project started out as a rock revetment for 4,000 linear feet. Through that review process, it got, through comments, review, change, it was changed to a geotube system instead of rock. And it was approved for the first 950 linear feet, which was the area that had the most rate of erosion from that large storm event. And then the 2015 order of conditions that was issued to install the 4th tier was issued with essentially the same conditions as the superseding order of conditions. In both of those documents, they identified that the original proposal was for 4,000 linear feet, that the project was approved, and that to have that first 950 feet installed for 3 to 6 years to give the SBPF time to evaluate alternatives, look at design and permitting before the extension is reviewed and for approval to extend it to the original project length of about 4,000 feet. With that, the most recent order of conditions 2824 said that the notice of intent could not be issued, could not be submitted until January of 2018. The project before you was submitted January of 2018. And basically, I think the SOC commented about a rock revetment or other alternative. Through the monitoring and the performance of the Geo Tube system with the sand mitigation, we've proposed here an extension of the same, of essentially the same project with the Geo Tubes covered by sand, because that system seems to work. There's no need to be proposing a project with a rock or some other materials. So we're proposing the extension. Again, the extension is about 2,900 square feet to protect 21 lots, 16 homes, 5 vacant lots. We've had that discussion before. This was presented, I think, at the December Conservation Commission hearing. This table made a few tweaks to it. Again, looking with the lessons learned that we've had over the last several years, the Geo Tube Layout, again, same design. The difference is the lowest tube would be set at -3 feet mean low water instead of 0. Geo Tube returns, we'd still have sloped Geo Tube returns at a shallow angle. Return extensions, none were proposed originally. A amended order of conditions was requested and approved. For Coiour returns, we requested in the November 30, when we provided a preliminary draft order of conditions to be something to be considered, to include a condition to allow Coiour roll return extensions when appropriate, when needed, similar to the design that you all have already approved for the existing project. Again, sand template management, we've talked about this several times. We reviewed that out already. Again, the 8.8 as a minimum with what was washed off, or whichever is greater. And we've talked about the fact that the 22 is not a maximum, that the fact is during a given storm year, if more sand needs to be brought in and placed, then the idea would be it would be brought in so that the 22 is not a maximum upset. But the idea is that you have 2.5 times the volume at the beginning of the storm season. That should be enough for most years. Even last year, which was a large storm season, about 18 cubic yards per linear foot came off. The extended project with the existing program, looking at the same monitoring programs, however, changed the shoreline to semi-annually, benthic, the bathymetric to annually, the underwater video to once every 3 years as opposed to annual, continue to do post-storm inspections, continuing to do an annual template survey, the alternative access, those plans, the easements that are ready to go, I think they call them trigger easements or spring easements. So I think that condition has been met and does not need to have continued reporting as that condition has been met. Again, annual reporting is the same. So once again, we've proposed some minor changes to the expanded project from the existing, which we think are improvements to the project based on the lessons learned. These were the notes that went along with that table. And, we talk about the bylaw. There were 14 homes that are eligible as pre-78. 2 are not eligible, but we're proposing to protect those as gap lots. 5 are vacant lots, eligible for protection to protect the public infrastructure from damage. Compliance with the performance standards. We documented that in detail on October 1. If everyone stayed awake for that, it was a very long review. There are a lot of performance standards here for coastal beach, coastal bank, under the Wetlands Protection Act and the local bylaw. So we've reviewed that in detail. That's in the record. I don't think we need to review that again. However, with that regard, the existing project was proven to received its permits and approvals, which means the issuing authorities determined that the project did meet the performance standards for the regulations and was allowed and permittable with the mitigation that was proposed. Therefore, the expanded project likewise, where it's very similar, meets those same performance standards and is also eligible for approval as it complies with the performance standards and the regulations. So we have a very similar design, tweaked with the lessons learned, a very robust sand mitigation proposal. In the monitoring that was requested, that's been ongoing, with some addition of some profiles that were added. And I think through that 3 to 6 year period that was identified by the DEP and the commission before this extension could be requested, shows that the existing project has not damaged the nearby coastal beaches in compliance with projects on a coastal bank. So with that, that's what we wanted to present. We've been talking a lot, when we look back at the record, the items that have been subject to comment and discussion and back and forth over the last several hearings have been those topics that we reviewed tonight. And I didn't want to go through the point-by-point comments on that we submitted for the record for the commission. So that's what we have for the presentation.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Scurry back.
I have
a question about the accretion. You noted accretion because you were based on mean high water.
That's the Woods Hole Group has been monitoring the mean low water contour.
Mean low, okay. Either or. Now, you think that possibly it's due from the nourishment, but could it also be possibly due to the erosion of the unprotected banks to either side, since we've been mapping the top of the bank and not noticing the bottom of the bank?
We've been mapping the existing project and also mapping the adjacent couple of 100 feet on either side. Mm-hmm. We see that has been losing. So the material that has, again, for the littoral system, the material that we're seeing and along the beaches, here, let's just, that's in front.
18, right?
And there's 90 and 90. Yeah, I don't know which ones you want to look at in terms of in front of the array or to the north and south.
Well, I noticed after the big event, we did have a lot of bank erosion in the north. Yep. And some really big erosion south.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's consistent with the natural system that
right.
material is going to wash off the bank onto the beach. Then the material onto the beach will over time wash out into the littoral system. Mm-hmm. The littoral system likewise carries material from the longshore, and with cross-shore sand movement, it will also be deposited onto the beach sometimes or washed off to the beach sometimes. So again, it's that whole system from the bank to the near
right.
shore where sediment can only be deposited off the bank and onto the beach and into
right.
the near shore. It can't go back onto the bank.
Obviously.
So when we see these movements, it's from the bank and the beach and the longshore sediment. Okay. And in terms of trying to
right, but
say
as,
what,
right, as opposed
what portion
to
is
whether,
what.
Well, that's what I said. I'd be cautious about saying the nourishment is causing it.
The ones that I suggest that the nourishment is assisting, not causing all of it, but assisting with maintaining a walkable beach are these two profiles that are right in front of the existing array, because that's where the sand, when it first washes off the front of the tube, will wash off and deposit first right in front of it, and then it will migrate down and then migrate longshore. When I say migrate down, migrate seaward
right.
and then migrate.
Yeah.
So over time, we're going to see that movement and that material being deposited into the littoral system.
So I was curious in the profiles. I agree with Andy, but we saw a lot of basically end scar on either end, and we have photographs for it.
Correct.
Where is that represented?
Excuse me, Ian, I can't hear you.
I'm terribly sorry. So I was just agreeing with Andy about the end scar that we witnessed, and I was wondering on the profiles where this was represented, or if it was represented at all on
Well-
these profiles.
What Wood's whole group doesn't show a red-blue dot for every profile when you look at their report. So I pulled out the ones that were representative of in front of the tube system and then a little up short, north and south. But this table is from their data. They do provide the data for all of their profiles. And in terms of October to October, from October 14, after the Geo Tube system was installed, to October 18, or September 18, when this survey was performed, we see the two profiles that are closest to the ends, we see accretion. The one closest to the north end, there has been some retreat, and we talk about how most of that was in the first year, and then it's been slowly accreting. And then at profile 92.1, there's been accretion. Now, they do their quarterly surveys when they do their quarterly surveys. So, during a storm, after the storm season, seeing some end scour that then gets rebuilt and replaced as part of the maintenance of the Geo Tube system, as part of the maintenance of the template. In fact, right now, when you go out there, you see that clay head area, the material washing off the bank has filled that area in that scoured into an even slope that's pretty well filled in that concave section from natural process.
And so if you could go back to where you actually show the profile.
And which one? This is in front of the array.
No, if you go back to where you actually show an aerial.
Yep.
There we go. So now, where is the corresponding number for where the end scar took place? How close is it to where the end scar took place?
It's probably this profile right here.
92?
So,
No, it would be
it's
91 point something.
Something.
question, you presented these two data points to us, right, 92 and 92.5?
Yes.
What happened to those ones? Was there
Right.
a retreat or?
I
I just want to make sure that we have like the full data set in there.
Correct.
We're not just cherry picking some that
Well,
might have shown a
The same is
Right.
true of the southern end
Right.
too.
Right. Well, the southern end, this is about the southern limit of the project, and was selected because that's pretty far afield. So, I mean, all of that data has been provided to you
Yeah. That's what
by
I'm
the
saying,
Woods Hole
making a
Group
note.
in the 77 survey, and you have that in your records to review.
Yeah, I'm just making a note of that.
So I'm curious about, again, the protecting the public infrastructure piece of this. Because if we're protecting more public infrastructure, further down here, that's maybe not covered by the current plan to relocate the road. My feeling is if we're protecting that infrastructure from something, then there should be, alternative access for wherever the infrastructure is being protected. So I
When-
just don't know where that starts.
When we look down at the project plan, this is the existing array. This is the extension to the south, the extension to the north. When we look to the south, most of this length is to protect existing homes. We have these two, so most of this is to protect pre-78 homes. It's at the north that we get areas that we more have the vacant lots where the purpose is to protect the existing infrastructure.
Okay.
And the north already has, as part of this of the existing project, the alternative access agreement, where the layout of the access has been laid out, the trigger easements have been established, and so that condition has been met from the existing order for that northern access.
Okay, so I'd have to see with my fellow commissioners. My feeling is if in the south, we're still protecting road infrastructure, then there should be some plan for that section of infrastructure as well, just to be thorough.
The vast majority of this length is to protect the pre-78 homes, and where we have a couple of the homes that don't meet the local definition of eligible pre-78 homes. We've identified those as gap lots to protect, so that you have a single contiguous array, so that you don't have weak spots along the bank. So and those where they don't have homes would also be protecting the road that's in that short segment.
Right, so again, my feeling is if the road needs protection, then either the town or someone needs a plan for the lower half where you're as well claiming that the road might be protected. That's just my feeling, to be thorough, if we're claiming that, that's why we're protecting that section. Thank you for clarifying where that is.
Well, I disagree with your characterization of the pre-78 homes. And also, I believe you're claiming homes to the west of the road.
No,
Or-
we clarified that in
Okay.
our previous submittal, where we
Okay.
just reviewed the homes on the east side of the road. I think in that, the notice of intent did, in January of last year, did identify the west side.
Right.
With that subsequent clarification of the homes to be protected, we only reviewed those on the east side of Baxter Road. So
Now-
I think we've clarified that it's just those homes.
Good. And so, is there any area where the road is in fact over 100 feet away from the coastal bank?
I would need to check a figure that we submitted. If you hold on, I'll check a figure. This is the sum total of everything that's been submitted in paper, minus a 100-page attachment.
Oh, since this first started, you've got this much.
I'll bring my boxes. Although that was a submittal to Jeff as opposed to a response to comments. Revised figure 10, which shows the corrected 100-foot buffer zone. But the other public infrastructure that we've also been identifying is the bluff walk and the vegetation along the bank of the existing. In addition to the, in addition to the road and the utilities in the road, we've also identified the bluff walk to be as part of the protection for the southern end and the vegetation along the bank. And I have to admit that I do not have that figure. And that was submitted to Jeff.
Well, Boyd's checking that. I think that we previously answered this question by breaking these up into, in a prior report, in which we had 4 categories of
Correct.
protectable, gap lots, and protectable but less in danger, but where there was the advantage of having both the bluff walk and the existing natural vegetation protected, instead of waiting for that to get washed away and having, more of the house at a cliffhanger. So I think that information is already
Correct.
in your file and broken up and categorized that way.
And that was in the November 16 submittal to the commission, where all those were reviewed. And Jeff, I don't know if you have the figure 10 that I resubmitted to you.
Sure I do.
Yep. That will answer the question about what is within the 100-foot buffer zone and what is not in the 100-foot buffer zone.
It would be the under 11.5 meeting documents
It was submitted
or the
Separately.
12.3.
It's in the Baxter Road materials.
Documents.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't-
I'm in that section, but
Yeah,
I'm just
huge
wondering,
section,
yeah, which.
If you let me
Meeting.
see your screen, I could tell you.
Let's see while he's looking if people have other questions, just to kind of keep
Yeah,
forward
I think,
progress going.
you know,
Yeah.
I
I know, I
haven't
was
seen
looking
that
for something
myself,
else.
and so if you could clarify it, that would be great.
Is there other questions?
Other questions?
Commission?
Ian, could you remind us of your assessment of pre-78, post-78, and kind of give us your totals of what you think is protectable and not?
You know, I don't have it here.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I did present it, and I stand by what I presented. So,
It's in here.
so on the east side, the houses, so 119 and 117 are vacant. 115, 113, and 109 are pre-78. Lots 107A, 107, 105, and 101 are vacant. 99, which was my parents' old lot, has a non-habitable shed from 97. 97 and 93 are pre-78. And then lots 91, 87, and 85 are vacant. And then I disagree with SPPF's assessment of lots 83, 81, 79, and 77. So-
To correct you, I think 81, we identify that it's not eligible. You and I are in agreement on that.
Excuse me. Yep. So 83, I said had more than 20% added between 82 and 91. 79 had more than 20% added in 89. 77 had more than 20% added in 2006. 75 is a 1940 dwelling. 73 had,
So 75, I think we're in agreement that
Yep.
it is protectable.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. 73 had more than 20% added between 89 and 2012.
That was one of the ones that we disagreed on.
Yeah. 71 is constructed in 1970, and so we both agree that it's eligible. And 69 was originally claimed by SBPF as being entitled to protection, although it was constructed in 1997. So-
Our November 16, we identified that it's not eligible.
Right, right. And then lots 67 through 59 are all pre-78.
Correct. And so with that, when I reviewed Commissioner Golding's materials, those 4 homes that I reviewed tonight that we had disagreements on, and we provided our rationale for our review of the building department records as to why they have less than 20% increase in habitable area and therefore are eligible. That's our review of the record. And it's submitted in the letter of March, in our March 5th, 16, as well as November 16, as well as March 1, and then tonight's presentation.
Okay. Other questions? I have one question that, I was reading it last night. I was going through some of these old letters and stuff. And I can't remember, one of the state letters had mentioned the concern of the limited resources of Nantucket for nourishment. And I wondered, have we made any more progress in finding alternative sources for nourishment, given the amount that this project will require? I know you mentioned one site off that you had talked to one of the local fishermen about.
The purpose of, in terms of the SBPF finding sediment, finding sand, the contractors have been identifying sand sources that we've been reviewing and approving for the existing project on site, on island.
You mean new pits?
Pits. We've also, we had examined some sand samples from an off-site pit, off-island pit. In terms of the sediment source, the project getting approved, then in terms of needing to find more sand sources, that will be the next.
I'm sorry, I can't hear what you're saying about the project was approved, you'll find more sand somewhere? Is that-
The intent is that we need, that the project needs to be approved. If it's approved, then, we'll continue to use pit, on island and off island pits for sand and continue to look for longer term sand sources.
Were you considering finding another pit actually finding and starting a new pit on the island? Or? No, you were looking at
we'd have to-
currently existing pits on the island you were looking
That's
at.
what's been used so far.
Yeah,
Maybe elaborate with that.
Yes.
please, yeah.
So Josh Posner from the
I think, Josh, you need to come up to the microphone because
Yeah,
the last
definitely there's some people aren't gonna
hearing,
be able
I
to
couldn't
hear.
hear anybody when I was reviewing the tape.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Josh Posner, for the record. So the question is, what?
Our concern is there's a
we're-
viable amount, there's enough sand to handle the demands of this project, and a genuine concern.
It is a concern. It's a concern of ours as well.
Yep.
We recognize that we are committing to a large amount of sand. We have some sources that we think are viable still on island. We have begun to and we did this year. We barged in beach-compatible sand from off island. We have identified and will begin permitting for potential offshore dredging of locations that people feel are viable and reasonable and environmentally sustainable. We have not solved the whole long-term sand problem, but we're particularly interested in the offshore idea because that gets most of the dump trucks off the roads, which we're able to, do because it's only really being done off season, and so it's a disruption, but it's a lot less of a disruption, obviously, than if it were happening in the middle of the summer.
As a third party.
We've identified some other locations that are possible on island. We're looking at a lot of different approaches. One of the things that we were able to do this year, for example, that we think also has potential as part of a multifaceted solution is to test and then use some of the excavation that's going on anyways on on island for construction projects. And so we did, I think, 3 or 4 different spots. Jeff, you may remember, and Jamie's not able to be here today, but obviously he knows it. Most of the sand on the island is compatible. because most of the sand on the island was created in the same ice age. But we do test it to make sure that it meets the order of conditions. So it's not any one simple answer. If we can get this offshore permitted, and that'll take some time, it's probably a couple-year project just to do that, that's going to make a big difference.
Yeah. Have you got a third party looking at doing sampling out there, or is it at this point?
Yes, we have started that.
Okay.
But it's one of those things that, we kind of have to do this in a certain order. We can't work on everything simultaneously. That's an expensive proposition. There aren't the appetite to spend the money to do the permitting for offshore isn't really logical unless we have a permit and the ability to expand the project. So they're interactive.
Catch 22. Okay, great. Thanks. We haven't heard much about it since I came up with my reading.
If I could jump in on a question, please. And Steve, Attorney Cohen, this is probably.
Do you have a microphone?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
So, I think everybody is concerned about the long-term sustainability of this project. And so my question is, if this project goes into failure and the Concom or a future board orders the geotubes removed, is there some legal way to ensure that current future homeowners won't block the removal of the geotubes?
So that's an interesting question. Part of it is a process question, right? So the short answer is, if there's a failure criteria and that's met that requires removal and the Concom orders that, I think that there's a requirement for an escrow and that escrow has been funded with the town, and there's been a protocol for that how that would happen that's already been provided and approved in the prior hearing. So could someone, if you issue an order removing it, could someone appeal that? Sure, but that's with any enforcement order. But I don't know that outside of the appeal of that order that anyone would be able to have any private property rights that would stop the removal once that order was adjudicated.
Well, I'm just sort of thinking of scenarios wherein the geotubes get sort of installed and actually inserted into the bluff face.
Right.
And removing them could potentially cause a lot more damage than leaving them. So that would be my argument if I had a home sitting precariously above this array. And I'm just concerned that project goes into failure, no more sand's available, funding's not available going forward in perpetuity. There's an argument that says, well, you take these things out and my home is essentially a goner.
Well, that's likely true if there was no protection, because the erosion would undermine the bluff and the bluff would collapse and the house would be gone, and that's the situation we'd be in. If I had to speculate, I would speculate that if there was an order to remove the geotubes, that there would be potentially an application for some kind of replacement of some system that would be not causing the harm that was, caused the order for removal. That it's not a 0 or 100 situation. There's obviously non-coastal engineering structures that could be approved, and there's other coastal engineering structures that could potentially be approved. So I don't know that we would end up with nothing. But if someone were to assert that they, were to appeal the order and that order would be adjudicated and they lost, then they would be removed. But that wouldn't stop somebody from applying to do something else to get a permit from you.
I have a question regarding the natural heritage letter that came in, I guess, on the 1st. One of these.
Correct.
So it mentions 55 Baxter Road and I know, and I can't remember the meeting date because this is a while ago, we had talked about how dynamic this project area is, and that at the southern end, it's more dune almost than bluff or bank. So, we wondered if maybe this project's a little extreme, being 4 tiers on that end that's dune. And in the heritage letter, they say coastal dune is present at this location. Therefore, prior to extension of geotubes on this property, the applicant shall submit the following documentation. And it asks for, site plans that are site specific to this location and topographic information of this particular wetland resource area. And I just worry that this project is designed to be so standardized that we're missing some of the important components of the resource areas, which includes the dune, at that southern end.
Right.
And that was, called out in the heritage letter, so.
The February 11 letter from the National Heritage, is that what you're reading from?
Yes, February.
Yes. And what that identifies is consistent with what we wrote in January with the notice of intent, that the project would not alter coastal dune to install the Geo Tube system.
I'm sorry.
The
Don't speak to me, speak to the
No,
microphone.
I have been.
Yes,
Yeah.
has been.
Well,
Okay,
it's
folks,
louder. I'm
please,
sorry.
please. Thanks. Okay, go ahead.
the
Do
the
your best, sir.
the project has been this one's on already, so
Look at this.
okay. Consistent with January, the intent is not to alter coastal dune to install this project. In May of 2018, we conducted a inspection of the southern end for the coastal dune. We determined the coastal dune in front of 59 and 57, actually it was mainly 57 where there had been dune, got eroded out last winter. As shown on the plans that were stamped and submitted dated February 8. We show the northerly limit of the coastal dune, and that extends onto 55. So this project would not extend south of that hedgerow between 57 and 55 unless or until that dune were to erode back, because we're not going to alter dune in construction. So basically, that's what Natural Heritage then identified several conditions that they would like included in an order of conditions in order to allow this project to be built down to lot 57. And we've agreed to that. And if there were ever the need to extend it beyond that onto lot 55, it would only be after the dune was eroded.
So then I guess a follow-up. So currently, there aren't Coiour returns proposed unless needed. So I'm
Correct.
worried that if there's no return at 57,
No,
that's like bye-bye dune.
the project, what we'll do is take the end return, and rather than having it, the project plans were shown to show that full extension to the south. But that end return will be moved northward above the dune so that we don't alter the dune, but that the angled return will be installed per the plan. It's not, we're not going to end it to extend the return sometime in the future. We're going to construct the southerly limit with the return, but that return not extending beyond the dune and not altering the dune.
Okay, because I guess one of the slides today made it seem like maybe the returns were only going to be installed if necessary.
The Coiour extensions, as we've talked about, that the Geo Tube system protects the bluff. North and south of the Geo Tube system, the bluff will continue to erode as it is now. And as the bluff, retreats, and then there's the need to extend the returns, similar to what was submitted to you all for the amended order, would be needed in the future as that adjacent unprotected bluff retreats landward, that those returns would be extended. So the Coiour returns that we've identified, we've specifically requested in our preliminary orders, to be considered by the commission. That was back, I think, on the November 2 or November 16 or 30 letter, to include a condition that would allow that to occur rather than waiting to get that permitted.
So I think it should be required to have those on install rather than have returns that we know didn't really work the first time they caused end scour.
The southern end, as we've identified, the northern end with the clay head caused some issues in terms of trying to get the returns installed properly, and then you have the return and the clay head, which is fairly much less prone to erosion, causing some issues. As we extend the project, we don't have that issue at the northerly end, and the returns will be at a shallower angle than were constructed for the existing project. And then as needed, as the bluff retreats landward, those Coiour returns would be added and extended as needed.
So, building on Ashley's question, since there is dune there, and the dune has just, I guess, ceased to exist in 55 and 57, or 57 and 59.
Correct.
How are the houses above there in imminent danger?
Because we've seen as the dune has retreated southward, then we get accelerated coastal bank erosion. And that loss of dune is what precipitates the increased bank erosion. So that's why the homes in fronting at 57, 59 are in danger, in that bank is much more prone to erosion than it is now, number one. Number two, in terms of trying to propose that we install the Geo Tube system with the template now, yes, there is still some vegetated bank there, but as we look at 59, 61, that area, we see that there's vegetated coastal bank, but we're also seeing that slough off, and we're seeing erosion in those areas and the whole bank shifting as the toe is lost. So rather than waiting for this southerly end to erode and have a denuded coastal bank, trying to stabilize that toe, preserve that existing vegetated bank, is going to lead to a longer term solution than waiting for that to erode and become denuded, and then trying to install the tubes, the template, and revegetate sand. So preserving kind of a, Benjamin Franklin, a stitch in time saves 9. So trying to take care of that now.
I see cutting off your nose to spite your face in this situation, so I guess we have different perspectives.
And
Mr. Feely provided a schedule or a calendar of dates and times of when sand was put over the front of the tubes. But we determined that there was 4 to 6 days that the tubes were exposed. Do we know the life of the tubes, how many days that the tubes been exposed?
last March.
Well, just the entire, like the day it was put in.
In terms of for the total lifespan so far for the past 5 years.
That came up last time. We only determined that in a short window of a month, it was 4 to 6 days. And that was
For last March, where we had all those back-to-back storms, there was, as we acknowledged, there was some, logistical challenges to getting it recovered. I don't have that number in terms of the total number of days that tubes have been exposed for the last 5 years. I don't have that. But the keeping them covered, the SBPF has been working very diligently over the last 5 years to get them recovered after storms, to make sure that the sand is available for the next storm, but also to protect the geotubes.
Sure.
Yes.
I mean, I think the reason that we focused on last March, Commissioner Topham, was because that was the time period when there were a number of back-to-back storms, and there were some relatively lengthy periods when the geotubes were exposed. Over the 5-year period, that was by far the only month where there was that kind of a condition. There have been times, of course, when the sand washes away, but we're able to cover them back up, relatively short period of time. I mean, if you take the period after March, for example, starting in April, from April all the way until the first exposure from sand washing away this late fall, the geotubes were covered 100% of the time. And there may have been a few high tides when you couldn't walk in front of the beach during a big storm because the waves were coming up right to the toe. But, probably 98% of the time you'd be able to walk in front of that beach. And that entire period of time, the geotubes are covered.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that there are days when there's a safety factor, when someone can't get down there, or you don't want the crew down there, someone getting injured or hurt. I get that, but yeah, I just was curious for the lifespan of this geotube. Like, now, if we're gonna go to 4,000 feet, that's, could be quite an excessive amount of, I don't want to say hard armoring, but it's gonna be a hard surface that could be impacted. And I'm just concerned about that without sand in front of the cover.
Right. In terms of the breakdown from UV of the exposed.
No, I think just the wave action just coming.
The wave
off
action.
tubes. That's where I'm kind of curious, because within that month, and I know it was quite a volatile month, there were a lot of days I was exposed, and what else has gone on? I mean, I'm sure there's storm seasons that it has been exposed, or high tides or whatever, but I just was curious, do we have data that says so many days over the lifetime it's been?
Yeah, well, we do submit a report after every storm to the Concom, and that shows when was the storm and when was it recovered. And I don't know that we've calculated how many days that means in terms of how often it was, but that data is there and is submitted to the Concom after every storm, every time there's an exposed geotube.
A concern I have in that regard is if it becomes necessary to really start bringing all the sand in from either offshore or by barge, and we get a series of big storms kind of backing right onto each other like we did, last year, and we have a situation like we did last year when there's a pretty extended period where boats are not going to run because there's just, it's just too dangerous out there. And I would think that would be the same for being offshore trying to mine sand in really high seas. And, if we don't have that on-island sand source and those tubes are bare and all the sand on the top's been already pushed down and they need to recharge like they did last year, where are they going to get that sand if they can't get it from off-island, for a week or two at a time? I mean, when they had that sewer break, I think they had to fly people over to repair that because they couldn't get them over on a boat. They're not going to fly sand in.
Slice open the bags.
That was actually tied into my question.
Don't give me
You
any
guys have a
ideas.
plan to stockpile sand for
Well, the template, in a sense, is a stockpile. So the template is 2.5 times the average amount of sand that is calculated to wash away. So that is your main stockpile. We do have on-island sources for sand to supplement that. But our expectation is that even for the largest year that we've had in a long time, which was last year, the template itself, had it been full, would have been enough to get through the entire year. I think 18 cubic yards per linear foot was what was contributed during last year. So that's less than the 22 if all 22 had been there at the time.
The tricky part with that is we don't know how much the template would have lost if it had been covered during the month of March. So that number is slightly off because there were days where it's not taking from the template, there's nothing to take. So
Well-
there's this mystery with how much would the template or the Geo tubes have given had they been covered. So I just worry that and I know it seems like tedious data collection, but we're missing this important information, and I don't know how you guys would propose to collect it, but this has been brought up multiple
Well,
times.
it's less,
Can I answer that? I think that is a key issue because it's frankly entirely the wrong way of looking at it. How much sand would be contributed during the period between when the sand is washed away and when it's recovered is not the key issue. Mr. Berman's report says that when the bags are exposed, that is a time where wave action could cause damage, and that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. But it is not an issue where the loss of sand is an issue, because sand is looked at over the contribution period, not over that daily period. We fully acknowledge that if more sand was there, it would endlessly be contributed during the storm. But the question is not whether or not enough volume was contributed during the storm, it's whether it was contributed during the year. The time period is what is not that like last day of the storm.
I guess I respectfully disagree with that because they need to be covered during the storms. Mr. Berman's letter said that's the issue. So if there was sand in front, they would be covered and it would be taking that sand. So
I disagree. So here's the key, Ashley, and I really mean this respectfully. You have to differentiate between the impact of the bags being exposed on wave energy bouncing around and the impact of the bags being exposed not contributing sand. And Mr. Berman's here and he's better qualified to answer this than I am, but I think his report plainly says that an exposed bag potentially causes an issue with wave refraction or reflection or whatever, but the lack of sand contribution at that time is not the issue, because sand is looked at as a contribution, not on a moment-by-moment basis. And in fact, as I've stated before, the second or third day of a big storm, there's a gazillion tons of sand in the water column already. What's being contributed at that time is probably the least important sand, because all the sand is already being swirled around. So you don't look at what moment or what day is the sand being contributed, and was it on a day when the bags were exposed or not exposed. You look at what was the sand volume contributed for the year, and then entirely separately from that, was there an adverse impact of the time period where the bags were exposed?
And
Am I right?
Right, and building upon what Stephen is saying and what we presented in terms of the mechanisms of sand movement with that cross shore and longshore, when the material is washed off the template, it isn't washed off the template and put out into the offshore system and gone. It's washed off the template, it goes onto the beach, which makes it available to the swash zone, which means it can be dragged out over time into the breaker zone and into the nearshore littoral transport system. So it's not being washed off the template and then gone forever. It's being translocated from the front of the template to the beach, to the nearshore, to the breaker zone and out. Right. And that happens over time. That's why the mitigation measures, the mitigation volumes established by DEP and CZM for other projects for projects are based on the average annual, because it's the annual volume of sand into the littoral system that you want to maintain. And this project has a very robust mitigation system. Most projects that have been permitted have a once-a-year placement of sand as part of their project, and that's it. This project has placing the project on the template as the on-site stockpile so that it's available to recover the tubes after erosion events per the existing order for the current projects and what we'd expect for the future project. Right. So you have on-site storage, and then you're gonna have to make sure there's available sand to replenish that during the off-season, and then, so the template, the top of the template is that on-site storage stockpile.
And because of what Dwight said about how the sand moves from the template to the beach, into the swash zone, and so on and so forth, There's another reason it doesn't necessarily go like from the template to downdrift beaches where it's suddenly on the beach there or not on the beach there. It is, it's that second or third day of the storm sand doesn't suddenly immediately go out into, Sacajapon Beach or something like that. It takes a while to get out into the system. So I would say that in terms of sand contribution, that second or third day is the least important day for having sand contributed, although it may be important for whether or not the geotubes are impacting other things. But the sand contribution at that point is the least important. And then you really look at it in terms of annual sand contribution, which I think we're putting in a system in place that allows for meeting or beating it over and over.
In those profiles that we showed as part of the presentation, the blue dot, red dot profiles, shows the accretion after a big bluff erosion event onto the beach. And then it takes time for that sand to be contributed off the beach through those transport mechanisms and along the shore.
Should we have Mr. Berman come up and?
Mr. Berman is here from the has questions about his report.
I'll get back to you. I want to stay on the same track. But my question is a little different now. It's about a year ago March. So I want to make sure I get this straight. So a year ago March, we all know that month was a terrific storm event month. And so the extended period of time that the bags were exposed, part of that was because safety of putting a crew out there to cover it, but part of that, I believe, was mobilizing the equipment to do so. You've rectified that by putting your own machine there, so that possibly wouldn't play out a scenario like that again. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would help. If we had our own bulldozer like we currently have now, if we had that back in March, we would have been able to recover faster. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't have had some periods with back-to-back storms when it wouldn't have been safe to be down there, even with our own bulldozer. But we've improved that situation by having the equipment and having the operator available.
And just let me add to that, we have the dedicated equipment and operator. There's still two backstops to that contracts with two other contractors for equipment and operators, so that it's not relying upon one piece of equipment and one operator. There are two backstops to that.
But
Mr. Chairman, could I just elaborate on one thing that Ashley had asked about this, the question of the mystery of how much would have washed away, we'll never know. And that's true. We've got the geotubes protecting 950 feet of bluff, and how much would have washed away from that bluff if the geotubes weren't there? No geotube project, just exposed bluff. How much sand would have washed away? We won't ever know that because the geotubes are preventing that from happening. We would know how much washes away from the front of the geotubes, but not naturally. What we do know, however, is how much washed away from the unprotected bluff immediately to the north and immediately to the south. Now, that's not necessarily the same as would have washed away from the 950 feet that are protected in the middle, but it's a pretty good approximation. And that gets measured by 3D surveys once a year. And what that showed last year was about 18 cubic yards washed away. That's a very big amount from the north and from the south compared to the 4 years prior to that, when it was more like 4 or 5 yards. So the average that gets calculated has big years and small years.
I guess what concerns me about using this average is now we're going to extend this project. We have Dune clearly on the south end. The average is very skewed where different locations are going to require vastly different amounts of sand. And I'm worried that we're not really able to look at this thing so that it's functioning even somewhat naturally to the bluff. And I'm worried about the implications to the other resource areas over time. That might not be noticeable in a 3-year period, but 10, 20 years down the road when we don't have a beach, it's a big problem, and I think we do need to kind of get at it now. Because this project area, if it's, an average of 18 up at the north end, I don't know.
So
the average doesn't
there isn't
work.
anything that's an average of 18.
Last year you said that
was
an
one.
average
That
of
was
18.
that
Right,
was
so
a-
that's what I'm referring to.
That was 1 year.
right.
Right.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Josh, I have a question for you. When you talk about having your own equipment, but it's not going to be actually on the geotubes before a storm, is it? No. So at Hoyks Hollow, the access at Hoyks Hollow, that was completely swept away last year, and you had to rebuild the access to get your dozer down there. So I think a concern that I think more than just I have on the commission is how long it would take. And if I think when we have another storm event like last March.
Well, I mean, I think it took about a day to rebuild that ramp. I mean, they deliver the hardener and dump it over the bluff.
Right.
create a ramp, and
I
then
think
you
Jamie
have
said 3
access.
hours, actually. I think Jamie said 3 hours.
3 hours. Yeah.
Right, but I know the geotubes were exposed for weeks in total there because I took pictures.
Right.
So, I think, it's a justifiable concern when you have nearly 4,000 feet of the equivalent of hard armoring. And I think the statistic that we were given was that, in fact, the sand in front of the geotubes was, 6 cubic yards per linear feet. So it was considerably less than what would have come out of the bluff, even though we're all in agreement that we don't really know how much would have come out of the bluff.
Well, 6 is a lot. I mean, what we're saying is that in a big year, 18 came out in a whole year. So for 6 to be able to come out in one storm is a lot. It's 2/3 of the average. 2/3 of an average year is available in a given storm.
And I guess this hasn't been talked about, but speaking of Hoyks Hollow, because I know
I didn't mean to leave.
Jamie Feely did mention that the new bulldozer won't stay on the tube. So like to replace every day, it has to go back and forth and be taken off the beach. If, how often that's happening and what are the negative impacts to the beach habitat to the north, ultimately, with heavy machinery. Like how often is that happening? How long does the beach have to recover in between? Because that has its own impacts.
Okay. I actually wouldn't mind hearing Mr. Berman's view of the contribution during storm events. And I do appreciate your report. I just,
So I'd say if you guys have specific
Absolutely.
questions, and not that we already all don't know, you can just introduce yourself for our minutes taker for the record.
Sure. So my name's Greg Berman. I'm the Coastal Processing Specialist with Woods Hole Sea Grant. And maybe start with questions. A lot of things have been swirling around. Which one do you want first?
I guess one of my main concerns, and it sounds like it's a concern of most of the board, is the importance of contribution during storm events. I mean, we understand that they're putting a lot of sand into the system. It's just, I think most of our concern is when it's being put in, and your view on that.
Right. So in my report, I talked about how during a storm, the template design is well conceived, that it's providing material during the storm. And that's really when the resource areas need that input of material. So a concern would be is if that template, or at least the lower portion of the template's taken away, and now you have the geotubes interacting by themselves. One way to think about it might be if this was a very simple, small pre-78 revetment, right? You would probably only be requiring the annual nourishment the folks are talking about. Because this is a bit of a special case, it seems like we're also talking about trying to reduce the wave reflection of the structure itself. So whether it is or is not a CS is up to you guys, but if it's acting as a CS with wave reflection, the template in front of it hopefully will defray some of that wave reflection. As was indicated, a certain period of time after the beginning of the storm, it's exposed, and then it stays exposed, so it's not actually providing that buffer during that time. I could see going into the future that being an issue, just because it's going to require a larger and larger template over time when we're talking about many years, maybe even multiple decades. You're going to need more than the 22 to maintain enough material in there for a given year. It sounded like we used about 2/3 of it during that past March storm, and that's probably going to ramp up.
For the year, that included, for the sand year of 17 to 18, that included March of 18.
Right.
It used the 18 over the course of that winter, over the course of that storm season. Not that it took all of that just in that one storm season, in that one month.
But it probably would have taken more if it was put in like the next day, because it would have continually kept taking it away. We don't know the full volume that would have been required to mitigate it. It might have been around 22, might have been more. That may have been an exceptional year. And really it was. That storm lasted much longer than usual. We had a second winter storm come and kind of merge with that when high tides were excessively long. But you may have heard about new normals, right? So, I mean, maybe this is something that's going to be going into the future.
In a sense, you're saying that you would anticipate that more and more sand would be needed annually so that you wouldn't get the peninsular effect going out like a pre-78 hard structure. Am I summing that up correctly, or?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, going into the future, if you're trying to maintain the beach at a certain elevation, if you're trying to provide the same amount of material into the system, I'm sorry, let me step back. Providing the same amount of material based on an erosion rate from when the shoreline was in a certain position. Mm-hmm. Now the shoreline is going to be further out, and so if it was going to be maintained naturally out there, it would be eroding much more quickly. But it's not, because it has the Geo Tube as kind of a backstop. So it's going to take more and more sand over time in order to maintain the template. But as some folks have indicated, and is entirely true, there's a lot of sand moving around in this area. So if it's not provided by the template, at least in the short term, it's probably going to be provided from updrift areas. So there's going to be some sand in front of the beach. It's just how much is being reduced by potential interaction with this structure.
May I just point out that part of the adaptive management that has been proposed is to measure what's been lost off the template at the end of the season and to replace that, so that it's not proposed to have a fixed volume every year, as most projects are within the Commonwealth. But to do that, so over time, that volume changes. The adaptive management means that volume changes as opposed to it being a fixed volume.
Right, so eventually the entire template volume might need to go up, right? Depending on...
Perhaps, yeah, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball to say what will happen, but the adaptive management allows that to be adaptive as opposed to it being fixed.
Sea level rise would, I assume, become more and more of an issue, even in the next 10 years, let alone in the next 30. So wouldn't that also put pressure on this structure, that it would basically, as the sea level rises, then you wouldn't really have a walkable beach in front of it, all other things considered?
Well, sea level rise is insidious. It's relatively slow rates, even with the projected increases. And when you think about the sea level rise curves, usually most of that curve is at the end. So 2100, you're going to see a lot more change in those 10 years than you do in the first 10 years. That's not saying it's not going to have an impact. I mean, we're still seeing a foot and more, just even historically, over 100 years. But when we're talking about the first 10 years, it gets a lot more difficult to see that particular signal. It's going to be a lot more the shorter term storm events that are going to drive the erosion along there.
So, I was out there after all the storms, and I noticed there seemed to be a significant dip in the beach in front of the geotubes. So, I'm a bit surprised that there's an emphasis on the sort of annual rate of sand loss, when it seemed to me that there was, I could characterize that as short-term damage to the beach. Is that the wrong way to characterize the fact that there was significant erosion in front of the geotubes compared to the, this was my personal view, so I couldn't take transit measurements compared to where there wasn't a geotube?
So that's kind of the classic look of wave reflection along a structure. You'll see a reduction in elevation right at the toe of that structure. So that is short-term impact. And really, when we're talking about compensatory nourishment, there's a few different types that have been used in the region. One is the classic making up for the contribution it would make on an annual basis. So that's to provide material to downdrift beaches. The other, I've seen some areas that have very punctuated erosion, and they'll come up with just trigger points that when the beach hits a certain elevation, that's when you have to nourish back to that elevation. So, and really that type of trigger nourishment happens a lot with non-CES alternatives, that if you have a core system or a sand fence type system, you might be required to keep it covered, and it makes sense to keep it covered because it'll degrade, and you're more worried about the elevation on top of that structure versus the annual contribution. Really, this proposal, it's kind of trying to figure out whether it's being treated as a CS or not as a CS, and it's got combinations of both within it with the requirements.
I'll comment on that. At least my opinion, this is definitely a coastal engineering structure. It's just a question if it's got a sand template in front of it or not.
Right.
But it's hard. I mean, you go out there and bang on those tubes, there's nothing soft about them.
Although they're not, I mean, you guys are presenting it as a coastal engineering structure, so it's not really, it's not really, that's not
Be doing this.
please, go ahead.
I just point out one point of what Mr. Berman commented about would be, in what the commissioner mentioned about seeing that erosion at the toe. And, the project design is designed to accommodate that because it has the potential to happen and was observed last March. So with the project, we see that the beach, the lower two geotubes are buried under the existing beach. And with the current project and the proposed project is also this little skirt that is there that should it erode below that then falls down to prevent undermining of the system. So the engineers understand that can happen, and so it's designed to avoid the undermining by burying it and having that skirt. Number one. Number two, when the sand gets pushed down, for engineering design, the figures show these nice angles and nice slopes and everything. But we know that as that sand gets pushed down, it's a slurry, it's a mixture, it's gonna then fill in that hole and then start to build up too. So that the sand that gets pushed off the top of the template to recover the tubes also goes into backfilling that hole, because it acts like it's a solid, but it acts like a fluid material, and that it's flowing, but it's, so there is some of that short-term damage that gets repaired quickly.
And when we're saying short-term damage, I mean, it's not like that sand is gone, right? So, I mean, it's just moving down the beach or maybe cross shore. So it's not like it's disappeared altogether. It's just that kind of reduction directly in front of a structure is detrimental to the structure, unless you have a scour apron or something like that that's going to protect it. So, I mean, the sand is moving away from that particular area more rapidly than it would be if that wasn't there. But directly, like in the middle of the structure, it's not a big a deal. It's on the edges of the structure that you have to really closely monitor that kind of reflective focusing.
So people to the north of this proposed increase in length have worried that if in storm events like last March, that Sacajawea Pond will be breached at a higher level than it has been in the past few years, and that their properties will be threatened to the north by additional erosion. Is that a reasonable concern, or do you feel that this length won't make much difference to properties that are a mile further north?
Well, I mean, if it's a mile further north, there'll be an effect, but it's going to be a dampened effect the further away you get. And there is material going into the system from this. Certainly not the wave reflection is not going to affect a mile north. It's just any potential reduction of sediment supply. And if there is more frequent breaching, that may be more for the storm systems or over many decades a higher sea level regime.
So the wave refraction would impact the ends.
Right, the ends and then maybe a short tens of feet away. We're not talking miles.
One of the things that I just want to remind the commissioners about and everybody, because people have been looking at this beach for a long time. Yes, in front of the geotubes, when the sand is washed away, there is a tendency for the sand immediately in front of that, the beach immediately in front of that, to drop. But that beach drops everywhere. Well before the geotubes, you would see some of the leftovers of the old beach dewatering project and other kinds of posts. You'll remember this, that become evident after a big storm, because the surface of the beach in a big storm drops not a foot, it drops like 8 feet, and then within the next 2 days is back up 8 feet. And so there's a big dynamic movement. It's not just simply a question of the only place that the beach is lowered during a storm is in front of the geotubes.
And building upon what Josh has said, that this beach, the shoreline, as you observed, many beaches have a winter profile and a summer profile, where the winter profile is lower because of the storm events, and then the calmer waters build up the beach. The beach that I live on, we see that pretty regularly. This, we don't see that so much in terms of a winter beach and a summer beach, but a storm beach and a post-storm beach, which is what Josh is mentioning, because we're not seeing big changes in the data between winter and summer, but those storms wash it, and then the quiet times between the storms, it builds it back up. Because I think, as Mr. Berman mentioned, in terms of the volume of material that's moving along here is huge. That's in the system. So, we have observed that in the data.
And certainly some other areas, think like Nantucket Sound, Shoreline, Cape Cod, we don't get that kind of summer, winter recovery, storm recovery. There's just not as much material in the system. Out here, it's because it's a robust system with a lot of material in it, it can recover like that.
And you don't have the materials on the Cape because it's mostly hardened at this point. I mean,
along that shoreline,
it has pretty much historically been, yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, just a quick clarification. So if we're kind of separating out the annual contribution being enough versus during a storm event, and I think we're all getting kind of stuck on that. the geotubes sitting exposed for a period of time. So how detrimental is that? We're saying tens of feet from the end as far as refraction goes, but is there more to that story? Is there an increase in or differences in longshore currents and pulling from other areas, or is it really kind of contained to tens of feet rather
So-
than miles or something?
I guess rethinking on it, when I'm saying tens of feet, I'm talking about standard projects. When we talk about 1,000 feet or a 4,000 foot project, it could extend further. I'm still not envisioning it a mile, but I mean, maybe high tens of feet we're talking about now, as opposed to just the standard flow along a seawall. I'm sorry, when we're talking, and I like the idea that figuring out the appropriate volume coming out of the bank each year being replaced regardless of what happens to the template. Honestly, 10 years from now, that's probably not going to matter as much because it's probably going to be taking that much off the template regardless of what the order of conditions is. But at least starting off, it seems like a good idea. Over a longer period, it's going to be taking more out of that template, though, and eventually it's going to be that coming out not naturally, but automatically without that particular trigger for annual nourishment.
So would you have a suggestion then on how to reevaluate that? Is that something you do on a yearly basis? Like, how would you recommend figuring that out? Since we don't know how much gets, maybe not contributed because of storms, what would you recommend there?
So, one, you've got your annual contribution the bank provides. The other is if we're trying to stop all wave reflection, which is very difficult. And honestly, that there's really, if this was a standard sloped revetment somewhere, you probably wouldn't see that kind of condition on it. But if we're trying to stop reflection as much as we can, just making sure that it stays covered as often as possible, and then having some kind of adaptive management where you can increase the template volume in a year that, like if we had a significant storm and it took all 22 yards off the template, that might mean we need more in the template going into the future. Or if it gets close, put in a little safety buffer in there.
When you say wouldn't see it in a standard revetment, what do you mean by that?
I would just say
Like
that,
a stone revetment?
yeah, typical sloped rock revetment
Yeah.
for a pre-78 house that
Yeah.
Most conservation commissions will require a compensatory nourishment, but not necessarily required to keep that revetment covered at all times.
Right.
So originally we had a provision that somehow got lost about trying to have an analysis of microbiological life on the beach, the megafauna and macrofauna. And we never got an analysis of the megafauna, i.e., particulate matter, animate matter of 50 microns or less. How important is that within your purview, and how important do you think that is to sort of, my understanding is that it's the basis of all marine life, like plankton is, to mammalian life in the ocean. Is that something that we should be concerned about, or are we talking about such a small length that it really doesn't matter, or is that something that you think will be impacted by both using the bulldozers on the shore and the positioning of the geotubes themselves? Is that too vague a question for you?
It's a little outside my purview.
Okay.
So I'm a coastal geologist by training.
Okay.
And I mean, I can speak to how tire impacts on rack lines inhibit dune formation, things like that. But it's,
Okay. All right.
Critters.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond to that we did respond to that question earlier in the hearing process.
Yeah.
Number one, the commission, the order of conditions required that the sand, that the beach benthos be monitored, be examined. It required that the monitoring plan be submitted to the commission for review and approval. It was, and that approved plan was then implemented, number one. Number two, the myofauna, when we look at in the literature, even from beach nourishment projects, basically sterile sand being brought in to nourish beaches, that those beaches then develop a myofaunal community very quickly. So, I mean, in a matter of days, because we're talking about essentially, you know, microscopic materials that are in the water column that live in the interstitial spaces of the sand, and it gets moved in very quickly. So in terms of spending time looking at myofauna, we would see that recover very quickly if this were a beach nourishment project being put on the beach, you know, subtitled, you know, in the intertitle. So has been questioned earlier in the fall and answered in the fall.
Well, it wasn't actually answered satisfactorily as far as I'm concerned, and it was mostly macrofauna. So when we conditioned this, we didn't really condition it as though we were drawing up a legal document where every I had to be dotted and every T had to be crossed. So there was, if you go back to if you actually watch the hearings from 2013, 2015, there was a discussion about the meiofauna, and the assumption was, on my part, that the meiofauna would be addressed. But in fact, you used a 200 millimeter sieve, which is very different from a 50 millimeter sieve. And I have literature that shows that it isn't as simple, from what I've read, as saying that beaches recover very quickly in this situation. So I think it's a legitimate question, and so I guess we're going to agree to disagree. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. I just have one more question.
Sure.
I really appreciate you reading here. In your report, I think one of the other points that was contended or discussed by multiple people was the point that the potential for a project like this sort of grows. It just sort of, you know, it creates more erosion on its ends than its expansion. Could you kind of reiterate? I mean, are we just talking, we're talking scour and the inability to really control the tail effects of these projects, or?
Right, so I guess there's two parts. One, if scour is mitigated perfectly, you're still going to have erosion on each side. It's the natural erosion of the bank. So if you hold something out and the rest of it is moving in, you're going to have to keep extending returns, whether they be core or some other material, and that makes neighboring properties very nervous. And oftentimes you'll see neighbors coming in saying, now I need to put something in front of my property. If mitigation is not done perfectly and you have either a scour channel, reflective wave energy, a current set up along the side of this structure all the way down, you could focus that current directly into the bank. And I have been kind of encouraging folks to do what the applicant is talking about, a kind of transition between a harder CES type and a natural bank, whether it be core or envelopes, something like that, to just kind of soften it down so you're not going right from one to the other. So that is one of the things I try to recommend about going, you have to end it somewhere, right? And it's just how you're ending it. And I mean, if you start seeing a lot of erosion, I mean, you could start saying, well, a lot of that material that's compensatory annual, stick that on the ends versus the middle. And just, not that there's too much room in some of the areas, but if there is an area that opens like that, you could try something a little adaptive. But some kind of transition like that's good. I've seen some drift fence to try to trap it in there also, but going right from hard structure to soft gets it's not a nice combination usually.
So then would you recommend them just starting off with this project having core, now I'm like losing the word, core returns right from the beginning then, rather than waiting until there's a negative impact and then installing them?
If you can pull it back far enough that the transition material isn't going to negatively affect a different coastal resource area like a dune, you may not want even a perfectly designed core roll, the natural bank may retreat and you may actually have some terminal scour depending on how the waves hit it. So just kind of pulling that back far enough so it doesn't make things worse on any dune that's going to be a softer type resource area. But for some of the other areas that, like further to the north where it may not be a dune or there might be a clay area, that might be appropriate to start with your softer transition that you may not be affecting another area.
Sounds like what we're doing. Okay. Okay, other questions? Okay. Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Happy to.
Thank you.
Off the hot seat for a few minutes.
So, okay. Okay, so I'm gonna open this up to the public. I did have a request from one of the public who has a planning board meeting. Is that okay? Yeah. And
Yes, let me just keep the one I wrote on.
Sure, and you get the thick one too.
Yes.
I emailed this in, it's just to make it easy for you, so I talk fast and get on to the planning board
we
meeting.
get back to your late meeting. Sorry.
My
about
name's
that. Appreciate
Judith
it.
Eisner, and I live in Quidnet.
Okay. Could you state your name again from the microphone?
Yes, my name's Judith Wagner, I live in Quidnet. I'm here just on my own behalf. I wanted to thank you first for all the careful work and time you spent in reviewing this project, and had primarily two areas to raise with you. One of the things I sent in that Jeff has, and you'll have electronically, is a set of materials I sent to the select board, because I've done an extensive title search on the historical rights to the beach in below the bluff in Sankaty. And you may know this, but you may not, that at the time that right-of-way was created by William Flagg back in 1883, he said that the land is to be forever held in trust by the proprietors and their successors for the purpose of roadways or other public uses and purposes, and not to be granted or set off by them in severalty to any individual person or persons. And he also said, I hereby convey to the proprietors of right-of-way 2 rods wide, that's 33 feet wide, along the shore above the line of high water. So it's different from what the traditional public trust law is in Massachusetts. Above the high water mark, over and across the tracts of land, and to secure forever, notwithstanding any changes that may hereafter take place in the beach affecting the position of said line of high water. So I want the select board to know, and I want to put it in the record for you, that although I understand you're talking about walkable beach and measuring that against the low water mark, the easement that was originally created back in 1883 was really envisioning something that's more protected than that. And I think the select board, before approving any further licenses or that kind of use that would be destructive to that right-of-way held on behalf of all of us in trust, not outright, they just didn't buy it and then decide they could sell it later. It was created historically this way. That should really be thought about very hard. It's interesting, I sent you in December when I had to be away for a family emergency, going back, reading all the history of the geologists back in the 1880s. Mr. Flagg, who was the developer of Baxter Road, he facilitated their visits there. And they said at that time that this was probably the most important geological site on the island and among the most important in New England. So I think somehow, insofar as it may or may not have a bearing for you, we should be thinking about the historical significance of that, and that, at least as I look at it, that's no small matter. But anyway, that's all in the background. I don't want to take your time on that now. I do want to just offer some observations and requests. I hope that when you work on the statement of your order that you're going to be issuing, that you get independent judgment or write it yourselves and not have it start from the proponent to write it for you, because I think that you've got a lot of expertise here. I'm a lawyer by training, a law professor. I think that there's often a risk that if you have somebody who's the proponent writing things for you, it doesn't come out quite the way you may be thinking about it, and that the one who writes first is able to more clearly express what's on their mind. So I would urge you to think about that. I'm glad for the discussion and Commissioner Golding's work on what exactly the structures are that are protected, and I'm glad you're looking that closely and seeing the evidence on that point. My last couple of things are, first, I hope you'll do no harm here, and in my mind, I think the evidence suggests you should deny the proposed expansion. But if you were to authorize it and to have some conditions upon it, I hope that you would have enhanced monitoring and reporting, particularly as to Sacagawea Pond, because I think we're in an era of climate change, and I think all our great ponds on the island are vulnerable to rising water, storm surges, and things of that sort, and we really need to be very aware of what's happening. This won't be the first proposal of this magnitude probably coming before you, and I think you really need to think about and set a precedent about how you'll proceed with that. I also think that there's need to, as I said, really be careful about the narrowing of the beach there, because what was given by Flag to begin with, he envisioned a right that would continue to be there, that it would be above the high water line, and I think that's something we really should be thinking about, and that the state legislation about wetlands is typically, I think, imagining a property owner with rights all the way down to the low water mark, but here we have this distinct area in between that puts this in a special place, in my opinion, and needs to be thought about. I hope you'll be sure that there's significant secure financial guarantees, and I hope that you will do whatever you need to do to let the select board and the rest of the citizens know that we really expect them to offer you the very best possible legal defense if you're challenged on whatever your decision might be. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Emily Molden for the Nantucket Land Council. I'm kind of glad that Mr. Dunk brought up our tardy submission, because I was trying to decide whether to mention it or not. So I will. I completely understand the Commission's practice of setting deadlines, especially in instances of hearings like this that are long and drawn out. And I genuinely do my best to try and meet those deadlines, and I try to hold my consultants to the same standards. However, it doesn't always work out that way, and I just really felt the need to comment again to the Commission about public hearings and the fact that the public hearing process is ultimately not designed to ensure that the applicant has ample time to rebut all public comments. It's important for the public to have an opportunity to provide comment to you guys by the end of the public hearing so that you can take it into consideration during your deliberations. Again, I completely understand the practice of setting the deadlines and for the administrators, and I never intentionally am late, but sometimes it does indeed happen. For better or worse, their classification of our late submission as being objectionable or unfair is not going to discourage me from participating, but I just really dread the thought that an inability to meet those sometimes arbitrarily set deadlines might discourage other public from participating, because that I think would be really unfortunate and inappropriate. So I just wanted to bring that up to your attention again. I understand, and I just hope that you continue to encourage public participation across the board. So the Land Council, again, has nothing to gain or lose during this public hearing process. We really are here and spending our resources on our consultants because our members care a lot about protecting the same interests that your regulations protect. Trey and Applied Coastal couldn't be here today. Obviously, he's submitted a number of letters over the last few months, and I'll, for the most part, just let them stand on their own. I wanted to make a couple comments about a few outstanding regulatory issues as we see them. I couldn't really disagree more that the fact that the existing geotubes were permitted demonstrates that the regulatory agencies have already determined that the project meets all the performance standards. I think that it's important for the commission to remember that when this project was initially applied for, the existing project, that it was denied and appealed, and there was a superseding of order of conditions from the state, but that denial was never brought to Superior Court. And so it was never, judgment was never passed upon it as far as your local performance standards. Regardless of that, I also think it's important to remember that the size and scale and extent of this project makes a big difference as far as the performance standards and how they're applied. It's also different in this case because of the need to apply the pre-78, post-78 guidelines in both the state and local regulations. I think that clearly some of the eligibility of some of the structures is in question, and I know that this project involves a lot of details from the construction and the maintenance and ongoing monitoring. And I just think that during your deliberations, before you do get too bogged down in all the details, that you do take some time to really go through the performance standards, even look at the initial order of conditions that was denied and the subsequent one that was issued that was an approval, to remind yourself of the commission's thinking, some of you who were on that board back then. I think that the project is unusual for the number of vacant or gap lots that it involves as well, and so it's important to consider that when you're applying the performance standards. And also the fact that having to apply those in this case has created the need for them to apply for a waiver, and that the waiver that's been applied for requires that they meet this burden of proof to demonstrate that there's going to be no adverse impacts on the interests in the local regulations. And so again, I bring that up because they have responded or commented that that's not necessarily the extent of their burden, but that's what the waiver request requires. So I wanted to bring that back to your attention again. And then I think in closing, the applicant can continue to assert that their analysis is correct, that the project as it exists and moving forward, that the data shows that it's not having any impact on the beach and the adjacent resource areas, and that this project will not either. But again, as you guys have been discussing, the minimum 22 cubic yards per linear foot of nourishment has been required and has been placed out there in the template and in front of the structure, and yet the geotubes are exposed for periods of time when we have these significant storms, and there is end scour that's taking place. And unfortunately, throughout this process of the proposed expansion and extension, what's being suggested now is a new mitigation protocol that's only going to end up reducing the amount of nourishment that gets put out on an annual basis. And that just doesn't make sense or compute as far as trying to prevent impacts and seeing the end scour that has been seen and the inability to keep them covered during those storms, why we should be reducing the amount of overall mitigation. So again, if before the end of the public hearing the commission would like any additional clarification from me or from Applied Coastal, certainly just ask. We'd be happy to provide it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please.
Mr. Chairman, make a couple of comments based
Sure.
on the
Last two commenters. One is in terms of providing a preliminary draft order that we submitted a couple of months ago. That was not submitted to sway anything, and it was basically taking the existing order of conditions 2824, and it was essentially taking that and modifying it to address the proposed adaptive management and some of the other conditions that may be no longer applicable. So it wasn't anything new, and certainly it's nothing that the commission has to accept. There was just that. Number two, a comment by Ms. Moulton in terms of the issuing authority, not necessarily determining that the project meets the interest of the Act. Certainly, the superseding order of conditions could not be issued by DEP if they had not made a determination that the project meets the regulations and protects the interests of the Act. You on the commission know that that's your charge. If a project doesn't meet those standards, you don't issue the order of conditions. So, by reason, the DEP issuing the original superseding order of conditions was a statement that the project as approved met the interest of the Act and the regulations. So it's, that's, your charge. And number three, in terms of opinions of damage to the beach, loss of sediment, and things like that, the data that we showed tonight, that's part of the quarterly surveys that are submitted to the commission, is objective data. It's not an opinion of where the mean low water line is. It's not an opinion of the cubic yards change per profile. That's also documented in the quarterly reports. That data is just an objective presentation of the topography of the volume of material that's out there. So we're not providing any opinions. We're just presenting what you all request to be collected on a quarterly basis, and are resubmitting that.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Dirk, would you like to come up?
Well, Dirk's heading up. Just wanted to clarify something for clarity. Dirk can still come up. So the superseding order is only in respect to the Act and regulations. So it's just relevant to Master General Law, Chapter 131, and the accompanying 310 CMR. It doesn't apply to the local bylaw or regulations. I know it's going to be a question. So
Correct. But the subsequent order of conditions 2824 was issued by the Conservation Commission.
correct.
Okay.
I'm done.
And that subsequent order couldn't do anything to diminish the protection from the state act. Because the superseding order of conditions is sort of the highest level. So you can't come in and have a weaker local bylaw order. Right?
Correct.
Right.
Okay.
My name's Dirk Roggeveen. I'm an attorney. I represent the Quidnet Squam Association. They are an association of property owners to the north of this project. They have participated in these hearings since they started back in 2013 or something like that. And they were involved in filing legal documents with DEP for that superseding order of conditions. And I want to make a couple of references to that. The concern, as I mentioned, I think when I spoke last time here, is of the scope of the project and how it will, affect the properties to the north. A small project may not have too much of an impact when you take it and multiply it as large as this. The impacts increase, and so the scale of this does make a difference. Especially during those storm events when the front of the tubes are exposed. Imagine 4,000 feet of reflected wave energy, which we understand how, that affects the beaches right adjoining it. But it's also, during that storm, it's the loss of the contribution of the sediment into the waves that you see all kicked up during the storms that end up depositing. And if you see I mean, there's places on Nantucket where there are revetments, and you go after a storm and you'll see that they do get carved out on the sides. We have, even on the North Shore where there's relatively low energy waves hitting it during storms, you end up seeing huge divots getting cut out. And when you have I was thinking about this earlier, I don't know how long it's been now, 20 years since that big fishing boat wrecked off the coast of Sconset to the north. And very quickly during the storm, I mean, the thing's driven up there, the storms are swirling around the sand, and it builds out right to the fishing boat, so you could walk out to it. And that means the sand is actually being transported and deposited during a storm. It's moving along the coast, being deposited back out. That sand that built out to the boat didn't just come from the beach in front of the boat. That sand came from up and down, updrift, on its way downdrift. The purpose of putting the sand, I mean, a geotube or any hard structure is going to cause an adverse impact. That's understood. That's why the law prohibits them. But then the law carves out an exception for pre-78 buildings because the law was being passed in 78, and the only way they could get it passed was to provide a grandfathering provision for buildings, and that's the only word they use that existed at that time. The DEP was offered an opportunity during this superseding order of conditions. When Sconset Beach came forward, they had gotten an emergency permit, and an emergency permit was granted because if the road fell in and the utilities under the road fell in, then the people to the north of this project would have no access. The ambulance wouldn't be able to get there, fire truck wouldn't be able to get there, their electricity would have gone off, they wouldn't have water. That was the emergency that precipitated the armoring of a number of lots that have no buildings on them, and that strip that's there currently, and DEP allowed that as an emergency order. We didn't have a local bylaw provision for emergency orders at that time, and so the state act essentially did it. When the notice of intent was filed to sort of memorialize the project that were permitted as an emergency, Sconset Beach Preservation Fund wanted to add an additional tier, and they essentially wanted a permit that would allow this whole thing to sit there as built. And DEP was, the justification was, well, we're protecting infrastructure, we're protecting the road, and pre-78 buildings. And DEP said, they also were protecting the buildings to the west side of the lot, of the road. Across from the empty lots was another theory of protection. And DEP, being provided the opportunity, said no to the lots to the west. They're too far away. It said no to the empty lots. It said you can leave the geotubes that you put in for the emergency there temporarily while you abate the emergency by relocating the road. But they're not going to stay there forever. And the only buildings that allowed to keep the geotubes and have a fourth tier were the specific pre-1978 buildings with one additional lot. And I thought I asked this to go into the record. I actually didn't check to whether it was, but it's the superseding order from DEP. And it had a cover letter, which I don't know which came in as part of it originally from Liz Colhannis, who is the chief of the wetlands section at DEP, who had actually, I don't know whether she physically wrote this, but she oversaw the writing of the superseding order. And her letter in the beginning, on page 2, I think you should just pull it up and read it, because she describes what DEP's order is doing, what it's willing to do and what it's not willing to do. And it says 3 of the 7 oceanside properties within the project area currently contain pre-78 buildings, lots 93, 97, and 99. that are located in close proximity to the top of the bank. Further, the geotubes may remain on the adjoining lot 91 to provide an adequate level of storm damage protection to the dwelling on lot 93. Now, this keeps getting labeled as a gap lot, but what it was a lot. 93, the structure on 93 was right up near the property line. So if you essentially stopped the geotube right down at the property line, you wouldn't be protecting the house. So they allowed it to go over to the adjoining lot to protect that house, because that house was pre-78. It wasn't described as a gap lot. And it says in the northern project area and in the southern project area where the existing geotubes directly protect Baxter Road and public utilities, the geotubes may remain for up to 6 years or until such time when alternative access to the northern end of Baxter Road has been provided. Not planned for, not springing easements, had been provided, because that's what the applicants were representing. The applicants, including SPPF, was also the town. And the imminent threat to public health and safety has been abated, whichever is earlier. So either 6 years or if they got the road relocated sooner. But what that paragraph is DEP saying we're not going to protect empty lots. We're not going to protect infrastructure. That's not what the law allows. Now, our local bylaw allows for the protection of infrastructure, which tonight we've heard even includes the bluff path, but Mr. Cohen said, and the vegetation on the bank on the lower end. Well, vegetation is not infrastructure, and a dirt path is not infrastructure. But the question is, can you loosen the state act's protections? Can you start allowing hard armoring in areas that the state prohibits it because the local bylaw allows protection of infrastructure? And the answer is no. That would weaken the state act. So then why do we have a provision in the bylaw for protecting infrastructure? Well, Nantucket has coastal banks that are not considered coastal banks under the state act. They're sort of inland coastal banks. Sort of when you start at Nantucket Hotel, the bank behind Nantucket Hotel as Cliff Road goes up, that bank has been used or determined and permitted by this commission as a coastal bank under the local bylaw, even though it's not a bank under the state act. So it gets an order of conditions that's issued just under the local bylaw, and it allows for the protection of things like the infrastructure along the bank. Another one is actually the bank behind Codfish Park. The coastal bank, if you take the measurements, and I can't remember all the measurements for where the breaks are and to create coastal banks, the commission determined that the primary coastal bank was the bank on the ocean side of Codfish Park, and that the bluff behind Codfish Park did not comply with did not meet the standard under the state act to be a coastal bank, but it is a coastal bank under the local bylaw, which has different measurements about water level, height, and break-in bank slopes and all that stuff. So the commission can regulate that bank also, and the regulations that the commission uses allows for protection of infrastructure on those kind of banks. So those would be inland banks. It does not allow it to just override the state act's prohibition and allow for protection of infrastructure on banks that are under the state act, such as here, which is why the state said, no, you can't do that, but we'll let you keep it there to abate the emergency to those houses to the north while you relocate the road and relocate the infrastructure. So in order to give this project a go-ahead, the commission's, let me just go to the next paragraph. It says the enclosed superseding order of condition denies the installation of the fourth tier along 97, 101, and 105 because the geotubes in those areas don't serve to directly protect pre-78 buildings. However, 5 pre-78 buildings within the project area are currently located on the landward side of Baxter Road on 92, 96, 100, 104, and 106. These dwellings are located sufficiently back from the top of the coastal bank such as they do not appear to be presently threatened by erosion. So it's making a determination that is there a threat? Not currently. The enclosed superseding order of conditions provides an opportunity for the landward lots to file a new notice of intent to maintain the geotubes in that stretch of the project area prior to the 6-year expiration date. Any such future NOI must demonstrate that there are no feasible alternatives to the geotubes, such as relocation of threatened buildings, that the buildings are threatened at the time of the application, and that the geotubes or an alternative structure are necessary to prevent storm damage to those buildings. So I thought what was interesting is that the DEP parsed out lot by lot by lot, each lot, looked at the buildings and didn't just say, okay, is it pre-78 or not, but they looked at it and said, is it pre-78? And is it currently, right now, threatened by erosion? So we have buildings along here, especially on the south end, where the bank's been more stable, and I think the commission's going to have to go lot by lot and say, okay, this lot has a pre-78 building, it's set back 50 feet from the top of the bank is eroding at this rate. You have to have obviously the evidence before you to make these kind of findings, so that you can then justify whether or not they can armor the bank below that. But the commission's not going to be able to lawfully, I don't believe, armor all of these empty lots as gap lots. It's not a lot where it's right next to a house. It's a huge stretch of the project, which increases its scope and increases the damage it may cause. And so I suggest, if you're going to approach writing an order of conditions, that you start, and if you don't have the data adequate, you should get it before you close the hearing, so that perhaps the staff, or I don't want to load Jeff up, but you're going to have to go down lot by lot and fill in whether all the information you need to make a finding that lot qualifies for hard armoring. So that's the issues I want to address about the scope of the project. And then the DEP required the 27 cubic yards per linear foot, and they required it annually. And if you read the order, in this same order, it parses out how it should be put in, and it was a good plan. It also said that if there was more sand than would fit, it was supposed to be layered up in berms on either end, 300-foot-long berms that went out to the north and to the south of this project, so that sand would be available into the system as well. I don't think at this point in time, where you're increasing the scope of a project, you should at the same time be lessening the mitigation requirement, because the mitigation is what's required to prevent the damage to the coastal banks to the north and to the south. And that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
A second, please. Just for the record, the letter that you are reading from DEP, the reference to 99 Baxter Road being entitled to pre-78 protection was based on a misrepresentation of the building that had been moved onto 99 Baxter Road. So it was not, in fact, entitled to protection.
We came to understand that after this had been issued, unfortunately.
Right.
But
Mr. Chairman, I just want to
One second.
raise 2 points.
Okay. If we get more of these, we probably have to do a written submission back.
No, just 2.
I think people are getting a little tired.
Number one is relative to the order of, the superseding order of conditions. I think it's also on page 2. The DEP, in issuing that superseding order, as we indicated on our March 1 letter, also identified, and I'll read, the Geo Tube proposal has been presented as a temporary project lasting for approximately 3 to 6 years. The SBPF indicated that this timeframe will allow a long-term protection project, such as a longer geotube or rock revetment, to be identified, permitted, and implemented. The town of Nantucket also indicated that it will take a similar amount of time to undertake actions necessary to relocate Baxter Road, access to homes, and co-located wastewater infrastructure serving those homes in order to mitigate the imminent threat to public health and safety that warranted the issuance of the emergency order. As a result, they've issued that for 3 to 6 years. Condition number 41 in SE 482824 likewise identified the ability to submit a follow-up application for a long-length expansion, but that could not be done before January 1 of 2018. Likewise, with our letter of November 16, we did provide a series of figures that shows the offset of each home along this project from the top of the coastal bank, so that you can see what those distances are.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Who's going to threaten me?
We're trying to share the wealth.
Oh my God. Okay, Pete.
Hi, I'm Maureen Phillips, and I'm with the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy. And I just want to make some really basic points about common sense and the fact that this is a very long-term project. The threshold question is for you all to decide whether it makes sense in terms of damage to the natural resource environment to allow for the expansion of this current project to 4 times its size. It was clear today that there is not, when you look at the issues of sufficient supply of sand in order to maintain the geotubes as things that are not going to be acting like a coastal engineering structure, it's clear that the applicant is not clear about where that sand supply is going to be coming. And I would not hire personally a contractor who said, okay, I'm going to do your job for you, but I don't know where, I can't guarantee when my supplies are coming, and those supplies are going to be very critical to the project. We also know this is an extremely dynamic situation, and unfortunately, our entire planet is in an extremely dynamic situation. And the fact that there have been, Mr. Berman mentioned in his opinion, the fact that 5 of the top 10 rises at the Nantucket tide gauge have happened since 1965, when it started being kept, have happened since 2014. So 5 of the top 10 have happened just in the last 6 years. And sea level rise is growing. We all know that. We can't deny that. So I think it's quite fair to assume that there's going to be more and more activity, and the ocean is going to present more and more, the possibility for more damage will certainly be there. And the last point I would like to make is that that the data that was being interpreted, and the applicant wanted to underscore the fact that the quarterly data from the Woods Hole group were, this is hard data, and there it is, and we all saw the dots on the thing. Well, what they say those are going to predict is obviously their opinion, and that hard data, if you look at those, again, those lines that we could see, you can extrapolate them to go in one direction or the other. And we have a lot of, and unfortunately, we are looking at an environment that's going to be getting worse, not better. So extrapolating in the most favorable way possible in order to show that there isn't damage being done to the natural resource asset, I think is not sensible when you're trying to make a long-term decision. So we really look to you all to use common sense and remember that we're making a long-term decision based on short-term data, and I think that is something to avoid. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm
extremely sorry you've been sitting here for 3 hours. I know you must be tired. My name is Deanne Atherton, and I am here for the Coastal Conservancy, and I have 4 quick points to make. First of all, as you remember from the last hearing, in response to a question from one of you about the town having alternative access, Mr. Cohen responded something to the effect that that alternative access was predicated upon this project being permitted. And we sent an email to the select board, and we copied you in, and also to town council to get a clarification of that statement, because we believe that the underlying documents do not substantiate it, and it's an important matter for you to know about. We went to the amended memorandum of understanding. There's so many documents, it's hard to keep them straight. But in section 3 of the amended memorandum of understanding, it says, SBPF shall assist the town with respect to long-term planning for the possible eventual loss of Baxter Road, regardless of whether a permanent coastal engineering structure is ultimately approved by the Conservation Commission. So we are not attorneys, we are not experts, but we want to get expert advice from you, because the existence of an alternative access by the town is an important consideration, as you know, in the law which you are reviewing. The second point is, I hope that we can get into the record and we can ask the applicants, what is the expected longevity of this project? We have not seen in any of the information provided a figure given. There was a statement made that this won't be forever. So we think it's only fair in planning and trying to understand the adverse impacts that we have some hard facts from the applicant about how long they expect this project to last. It's interesting in looking back on the months of hearings about the things that have been said, and in fact, the applicants reviewed them this evening, but there's something that's not been said, and the applicant has been silent on, and that is the alternative analysis. There is an alternative analysis in the NOI. It is very cursory and, in our opinion, incomplete, because it does not contain any relocation alternative. And it does not contain any relocation alternatives because the applicants don't want to relocate the structures. But that doesn't mean that we all can't consider relocation alternatives. Because they don't want to do them doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And there are actually, 5 years ago, the commission found that there were feasible alternatives to the 900-foot structure. And that was one of the reasons that they denied to permit the structure. Today, there are even more feasible alternatives than there were 5 years ago. And there are 4 feasible relocation alternatives. And we have a very voluminous documentation of that, which we will submit to you for the record. The first one is that there are, we believe, but we're not absolutely sure, there are property owners north of Bayberry in the most threatened section of Baxter Road who own vacant lots across the street. So they have an opportunity to move their structures across the street to the west side out of harm's way. The second relocation alternative, which has already been demonstrated, was implemented by Mr. DeAngelis, who was the owner of 109 Baxter Road. And he moved his house west into the layout of Baxter Road. He negotiated an easement from the town, and he leased the property, and he moved his house back into the road layout and gained additional footage. And we have all of the documentation for that. And in fact, that was so successful that soon after he implemented it, he sold the house. The third relocation alternative is that the layout of Baxter Road is 60 feet wide. The asphalt strip runs down the middle of the 60-foot layout. That means there's 20 feet on each side of land, of layout land that's owned by the town. Conceivably, Baxter Road could be moved, the 20 feet width of Baxter Road could be moved to the westernmost portion of the layout, and that would give 40 feet on the eastern side for the structures all along the project area to be removed 40 feet westward. So that instead of leasing pristine historic beach from the town, which is going to degrade and destroy it, the property owners could move their structures 40 feet out of harm's way by leasing town land that is part of the road layout. The fourth relocation alternative is the fact that the town does now have plans to provide alternative access to the most threatened section of this project, which is Northern Baxter Road. And in fact, there is an expenditure item from the general fund for town meeting on the warrant in April to allocate $500,000 to begin the planning to move the infrastructure for that alternative. So the record, and again, we will submit information, the record is not complete without this information in it. And you know that the law says that this project is only possible if there are no other feasible alternatives. And there are feasible alternatives. And any cost-benefit analysis of these relocation alternatives, that would just show that in terms of environmental damage, let alone financial costs, relocation is a win-win. It's a one-time effort. There's no maintenance, mitigation, and monitoring. It's got a certain cost, it's got a clear outcome, and it's what Sconset Trust did with the lighthouse in 2007. We have not heard one word about that since these hearings began in September. Another thing we haven't heard anything about, and this is my final point, and I hope that the applicants can provide us some information. In fact, I was going to ask Mr. Berman if you had opened it up to let members of the public ask a question, but the proposed project, the length of the proposed project is about the length of 13 football fields put end to end. The best we can determine from these schematics, it's about 45 feet deep. So if you do the math, and we stand to be corrected on anything, it looks to us that just the installation of this project alone will displace 4 acres of public beach. The Geo Tubes will sit on 4 acres of pristine beach habitat. How do we mitigate for that? Where is the discussion about how we lose that habitat? How that's a protected resource under our law and the state law. And we know, I know, not like you do, but I know that there have been projects on Nantucket when there are resource areas that are going to be adversely impacted. The applicants have had to replicate those resources elsewhere. That happened with the Hummock Pond bike path. Well, what's the mitigation plan for the loss of 4 acres of beach? We will submit our written comments to you later this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm a week ahead. I think I swung forward a little.
Everyone's tired. Okay.
And then there,
Any other questions from the commission? And, okay, so I guess we're asking for a continuance. What do we have for dates here?
That's a good question. I think you can ask that, but what their prerogative is to do.
I think they're thinking about that.
But we can schedule it for whenever.
Yeah.
Next date in our normal, if we stay every 2 weeks for this, would be March the 25th.
March 25th. Okay.
Well, there are two factors at play here, because Ben is...
So we're just discussing future dates, and I think they're trying to figure out what they want to do. Oh yeah, that's not the end of the thing. So I think we'll find out what their plan is.
We're gonna change into a chair.
I'll stay through this, whatever it takes.
Thank you.
You might know.
We would not want to start
Okay.
over again.
Your term doesn't end till the end.
Would you guys like to continue till the?
We'll be done until we're in.
We would like a continuance.
Thanks.
Do you have a meeting date in mind?
I think we came up with a March 25th.
That'll be 2 weeks from
2
today.
weeks from today, okay. I think we're sensitive to the idea that appointments are up in June, which I think someone just commented on.
Yeah.
That this has been going on for a long time, and I think we have a ton of information, and I think the board is probably, or should be close to or at the point where you're ready to discuss amongst yourselves to, close the public hearing, or not leave the public hearing open, but essentially do that only as a side note to discussing in order. And hopefully we're at that point on the 26th.
Yes.
So that's what we'd like to request.
Okay, great.
25th.
25th.
What day is that?
That is Monday the
It's a Monday, I
25th.
think. Yep.
We'll work on the road.
Okay.
We'll do that for.
So-
I mean, if you guys want, we're happy to put together any information that you're looking for from the staff level, or summary, or
Well, I'm going
perhaps
to
in
personally go through the
direction, or what all those things will look like.
quarterly data personally.
Right.
Is anyone looking for anything specific?
I'd like to get a sense of sort of projected annual increases of mitigation sand. I don't know if that's even possible. Maybe that is something that we can get from Mr. Berman. Is that even a
Projected annual
increases?
increases? Sure, if you'd like to just, I mean, is that something you can possibly get?
Probably not. Yeah, so I mean, you have your annual compensatory nourishment based on historic rates. Coming up with some kind of projection of what the erosion rate would be into the future is hard enough. Coming up with something that's sticking out further than the rest of the shoreline is almost impossible. Coming up with some kind of additional volume in a template to be able to maintain a certain amount for storms could be something adaptive going forward into the future.
Is there a framework we can all come up with and agree upon that is?
Well, I think that's something that, hearing that if we were looking at it it sounds like we'd have to look at it in a condition sense.
Yeah.
I think that's something that if we try to put together conditions, and we can have Mr. Berman take a look at those, what those may look at, and kind of evaluate it and have something to come back to you guys with to review directly, would probably be more productive than trying to figure out as we go, especially after 3 hours of hearing.
Yeah.
Great.
But I think if that's what you're looking for, some way to better track and look forward, I think that's theoretically doable. Let's see what that looks like though.
Okay.
I'll try to write that form. But I think between our reviewer, council, and staff, we can put something reasonable together for the purpose of discussion.
I have a question for Mr. Bowman. Could I put you back on the hot seat, please? So, when I look at the composition of the bluff, it really looks nothing like what is being added by the applicant in terms of the sand. It's pure sand. It's not cobble. It doesn't have all the components that the bluff has when you walk along the bluff and see, or when you walk along the beach and look up at the bluff. Would you care to comment on that?
So I did look at your images in PDF that was available, and it does look like there's some color and granule changes. There's really not great guidance or very specific guidance. From the state, they talk about keeping it as close to the grain size as you can, maybe going a little coarser, but there's nothing talking about like the angularity or color or anything like that with any kind of basic sediment nourishment.
How about, as you actually look at the bluff, all the cobble that comes out, rocks that are 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches in diameter, all the way along, that I assume, has that contributed to the cobble on the bottom, or was the cobble on the bottom there first? Is that chicken and egg question possible to answer?
Well, the cobble is likely grouping itself. The fines are getting winnowed out. The cobble is in the offshore, put there by the kind of grouped together by waves in certain areas. So, all that was part of the floodplain that was deposited by the glacier melt. And so, these cobbles came naturally, eroded out of the bank and not necessarily went offshore, but when the entire shoreline retreated, now they're offshore and is forming this offshore cobble habitat. So, any additional cobble coming out of the bank now, you may not have as much. I haven't seen specific stratigraphy records that indicate exactly what is in the bank. I imagine it's a bit of a hodgepodge because we're in a terminal moraine in a lot of areas. Either that or the floodplain, which can have cobble in it too. But if this particular bank is mostly sand, and it might be because it's eroding pretty quick, although there's some clay outcrops and whatnot, maybe the Barrow pit has a slightly different sediment texture to it, but it is still laid down by the same glacier. It's not like it's going inland and getting something entirely different, but it's probably a bit different, but I don't know of great guidance saying the potential impacts it might have.
In that regard, does the silt and even though it's a fairly minor component, does that provide any nutrients for offshore algae or plants and stuff? Does it contribute to the marine system?
Probably less so in this site. You don't necessarily want much silt or fines out there. It's going to be more of a water clarity thing. Mostly the sand is going to stay. The silts and fines are going to get taken offshore relatively quickly in this high energy environment. But that's not saying that there's not some of that coming out of the bank naturally. So even if it's getting deposited artificially, it's making up for some of that. So, kind of a confusing answer, but it's not terrible to have some in it because the bank's made of it, but I wouldn't necessarily require it because that's not what's building the basis of the nearshore. And it's not like there's a large marsh nearby that's actually getting built up by the nutrients or fines in there.
That's interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we got everything we asking for, looking for? Other requests? Okay, so we'll continue till March 25th.
Yes.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
I don't have anything else.
We have nothing else on the other business?
No, you guys just skip it.
Approve all that? I will. We were here the other day, so.
And we're here next week.
Oh, God, and then
So-
the week after, apparently.
Oh, yeah. So we, so do we got a motion to adjourn?
So, Mr. Dunn? Motion. Yes.
Let's
Okay, is there a second? Okay, all in favor?
Yes.
Aye, great. Thanks very much for coming out.